Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest prejudices in the world. It goes back hundreds, probably thousands of years. That has a whole history of why that was and why it continued. But it is a reality that anti-Semitism, sometimes in violent forms, other times not in violent forms, but in economic forms and others, have made Jews at various points in history the other. They become the appropriate target in many places. In the United States, Jews for the last two generations, my generation and now, have been largely protected. We've been considered white. There was a time when Jews were not considered white, even white Jews, not even speaking of Jews of color, but white Jews were not considered white because they were immigrants. They came from parts of Europe that were not considered the good part, which was the Western part. The same way that Catholics were not considered white, the Irish were not considered white, Italians were not considered white, and they went through a process of becoming white in this country. Jews went through that as well. Jews became economically privileged and politically privileged in many ways, but anti-Semitism never completely disappeared. What we're seeing now is the roots of anti-Semitism in white supremacy. So we can't separate the attacks on the Jewish worshipers in the synagogue in Pittsburgh from the African American worshipers at the Mother Emanuel Church 3 years ago in South Carolina, or the two black shoppers in the Kroger supermarket in Kentucky. It's all part of the same pattern of white supremacy, of racism. So when we talk about how do we fight back against anti-Semitism, we have to start with fighting back together. This is the lesson that Jews have learned at some points and at other points have forgotten, that our protection is not from being a Sparta state of our own, but of being part of communities, working with others who are also themselves at risk, many times at greater risk than we are, working together to stop that kind of violence. And we should be clear, this kind of violence, this kind of anti-Semitism, the historic, racist, dangerous, violent kind of anti-Semitism, is the real anti-Semitism. We see the term anti-Semitism and the charge of anti-Semitism being used very widely around the world against people who are in fact not anti-Semites. We're seeing it used, for example, against Jeremy Corbyn, a dear friend of mine who is the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, because he has been historically always a supporter of Palestinian rights. That's a misuse of anti-Semitism. George Soros is simultaneously attacked for being an anti-Semite and for being Jewish. I can understand why this seems so confusing sometimes. I get accused of being a self-hating Jew or even an anti-Semite, even though I'm Jewish, because I support Palestinian rights. They are not the same thing. I think it's more important than ever that we recognize that the way to fight back against this kind of brutal, violent anti-Semitism is by uniting with people who face other kinds of white supremacy. We have to simultaneously build links between fighting anti-Semitism, fighting racism, fighting Islamophobia, fighting all of the attacks that we are now facing in this country, separate that from using the claim of anti-Semitism to charge people who are not anything close to anti-Semitic.